you can't sail directly into the wind. You have to pivot. You have to kind of zigzag towards the wind to be able to catch it and go towards your destination. And I think of that as how God leads us sometimes, where it looks like we're going in one direction, but we have to stay tuned in so that we can tack, we can pivot.
Welcome to another Reset podcast where we talk about emotional, relational, and spiritual growth. My name's Carissa, and I'm here with Julie and my husband, Jeff. Jeff, what are we going to talk about today?
The testing of our faith.
Testing of our faith. And I know today was the first day of school for you. So any tests today?
No tests at school today. It's a good day.
Good day for students then.
Yeah.
We want to talk about testing our faith. I know James talks about this in the first chapter of his letter. But the reason this came up for me was you guys, I'm sure, saw this summer the Titan sub that sunk clear down by the Titanic. And I know Jeff and I kind of took an interest in that. And I remember one night him saying that he read an article by James Cameron, the guy that produced the movie The Titanic. And he's apparently is like an expert on these deep sea submersibles. But he was struck by the irony between why both of these vessels had a catastrophe. And with the Titan sub, apparently it didn't go through all the testing that other subs go through. So there's like standards that industry has, and there's not many people in that industry. And a lot of it had to do with the material that it was built with. And the other people in the industry were so concerned about it that they came together and wrote a letter to the owners of this company and even used the word in there, this is going to end in a catastrophe, was their words. But they didn't heed the warnings. And of course, he compared that to the Titanic when the captain knew that there were icebergs ahead and he just wouldn't heed warnings. And so both of them went out on this big mission, but the one wasn't tested. They both didn't heed warnings and ended up in a catastrophe, not only not completing their mission, but a lot of people died in the process. And so I remember laying in bed one morning and I just felt, how the Holy Spirit can just kind of download something. It's not like a audible voice or even a whisper, just kind of a knowing. And I just felt like he just kind of dropped into me. And he said, and this is what he said, the same thing happens when people set out to accomplish spiritual missions, but they haven't been trained and their faith hasn't been properly tested. Their mission fails and a lot of people get hurt. And what the Holy Spirit was emphasizing to me was that testing and that training before people launch out. So that's my big introduction of how the testing of our faith is so important. And we want to take those knocks and those hits while we're kind of in this training, testing season rather than when it can really affect our life and other people's lives. So spiritual implications or anything you want to add from what I've just said?
Oh, so much. I mean, one of the things that makes me think about in terms of the testing and the implosion and was I recall seeing that the material, not only is it just being tested on the go, but it also can become weaker over time. And we think about God taking us from strength to strength and glory to glory, but on the flip side, we can go through, as humans, we can go through decision fatigue. If we're relying on our own strength, we can go through decision fatigue where we get so tired of resisting temptation or so tired and weary in the journey that we become more vulnerable, not less vulnerable over time because we're just worn out and we become easy prey for the enemy. And it just seems like that could be why they had a few missions where they felt like they could do it, they could withstand it, but in reality the material was just weakening over time, not strengthening.
Yeah, it stands out to me that a lot of people, their primary criticism of the submersible was the material, like the stuff it was made out of. And the issues with testing it. And when God puts us through a test, he's testing the stuff that we're made out of and to see if it holds, but it's really more so for us to see if it holds. Because there are other things that we have to do, but I think it's really natural for a lot of us to get pretty egocentric with that and think that I'm going through this test because God, on the other side of it, wants to give me more, expand my territory, give me more responsibility. And I'm not saying that's altogether wrong. I think that's true. But the problem with that, I think, is that when we talk about it like that, we don't talk about the humility that God creates in us or reinforces in us, and that kind of material. That stuff that can stand up to a lot of pressure. The problem was the carbon fiber on the submersible, and the testing tests what we're made of and strengthens what we're made of, so that not God will just give me more of this, give me more of that, give me higher, station in the church, or give me more responsibility at work or whatever, but God will make me stronger for kingdom service. And I think at the heart of testing should be an immense humility that we have, that if God is testing us to give us other responsibilities or additional responsibilities, we should not approach that with, I'm getting more. We should approach that with an extreme humility in our soul, and that should produce humility in our soul, which is much better material that can hold up to the pressure of whatever's on the other side of that test.
And I think, just to add to that can really only happen with introspection, right? Like, I think about in factory testing, they look for failure modes. What could go wrong? What are some things that we detect that can go wrong? Or keeping a list of things that can go wrong and how to mitigate it. And I think that during the time of testing, to use that time in humility to say, where am I weak, right? Like, how is God showing himself strong? Where can I see that I've been strengthened? But also, where are my weaknesses, and how do I make sure to let God in to those places so they don't become failure points?
And I think also it's when it's time to launch out, it needs to come from outside of ourselves. And so the example we shared, it's people that were experts in the field, or people who knew what they were talking about. In both cases, with the Titan and the Titanic, are saying, stop, slow down, don't go, and not listening to those voices, because we all have this overconfidence, and I shouldn't say all of us, but a lot of us, and what we think we're capable of doing, and so God puts guardrails in our life to help us from crashing.
There's a great story about that in the Old Testament, in 2 Samuel 2, where David's nephew, first of all, the Saul's men and David's men continued fighting. Even though Saul was dead, they kept fighting to try to figure out who was going to come out on top. And David's nephew Asahel was pursuing Saul's general to try to capture him. But Saul's general, Abner, warned him to stop. Asahel was a very fast runner, and Abner warned him to stop, that he was going to have to kill him if he came close to him. But Asahel just kept going. He kept running. He kept pursuing. He kept operating his own strength in spite of the warnings. And lo and behold, Abner did kill him in self-defense. But it was because he didn't heed those warnings. It was because he had this gift of running that he didn't want to release. He didn't want to relinquish. He didn't want to hold back the reins.
I think that's a good point, especially about in our lives, how we tend to assume that the enemy does not attack our strengths. And we tend to assume he attacks our weaknesses. And quite frankly, I'm pretty sure he attacks everything. And one of his goals is to attack our strengths so periodically, so regularly, that he wears them down. And he's always manipulative. And if he can flip a strength on you and use it against you, he'll absolutely do that. Like his speed, like his running in his hubris. I can do this. I can catch that guy despite the warnings from a seasoned veteran. You're making a big mistake here, kid.
That's such a good point. The enemy definitely goes after our weakness, but as I've grown in my faith, what I've noticed is he'll attack my strength, and I've seen that with other people too. And what I'm saying is that we'll rely on our own strength, or our own talent, or our own giftedness, instead of relying on God. And then that's just as much of a trap. If we're a really hard worker, or we're really disciplined, we can go over into the ditch of being a workaholic, and there's no dependency on God to do it. But we rely on a speaking ability, or our intellect, or whatever it is. But that actually can be as big of a trap as far as us unplugging from God, our source.
Yeah, and worst case scenario, you end up running on fumes because you can get by in your gift, and you don't realize that you're really hollowing out.
So let's talk a little bit about God's process of preparing people. And this really, it plays out all throughout Scripture. There's really a 3-part process. 2 of the parts are suddenlies. So the first part is the calling, and then it goes into the preparation phase and then the commissioning. So the calling really happens suddenly. There's that phrase in the Old Testament, the word of the Lord came to Abraham, to Samuel, to Gideon. And so this calling that comes from outside of us that tells us who we are and what we're called to do. And we love that. It's exciting. I heard God and he gave me a vision for my life. And then the commissioning part, the third part, is just suddenly God releases you to do it. But it's that middle area, that preparation that can go on for years, that we aren't always prepared for. And that's where the testing comes. That's where the tribulation comes. But that's also the training ground where God's preparing us. And so I always like to think of it as our competence has to be ready. So we have to be trained and strengthen our strengths. We're talking about strengths and weaknesses. We need to strengthen our strengths as far as our talents and our giftedness. But then our character weaknesses, that's what the trials and tribulations are for. God uses those things to strengthen our weaknesses. And that season can be long. Like, I know, Julie, you've studied David a lot, but I mean, how many years was he in the wilderness dodging spears from Saul?
Yeah, it was years. And that was after he got the promise that he was going to become king. Everything looked like it was just the opposite of that. But he had so many opportunities to prove his character and his integrity and really lay the foundation for the kind of kingdom that he wanted to run.
Yeah, and I think of Moses. He's called to be the great deliverer. It seems like God's process is, here's your calling, now go to the wilderness. Like your whole life goes in the opposite direction of what you're called to do. But I mean, Abraham, you just go on and on. But then you think of the ones who didn't. So think of Saul. Saul didn't really have a wilderness. He just became king. Compare him to David, who had a wilderness.
Yeah.
And that kind of shows the importance of the testing. Yeah. So James says in James 1:2-4, I think this is why he says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." So I don't know if you guys in your own life have any examples of things that you can look back on and say, I'm thankful for the test, or I'm thankful for the wilderness season because I know that it prepared me for what I'm doing now.
Oh yeah, a long dark night of the soul. I'm thankful for it. I hope I don't ever have to go back into it. But we talked about that on a prior podcast. But very thankful for it because of the immense grace that I only see now on this side of it that God was doing that whole time. In the dark night, and it makes me think too of when we're in periods, whether it's even just hours or days or weeks or even months of this spiritual desolation where we just don't feel the presence of God at all. It's important to remember the times when we did feel the presence of God and remember the good times to help strengthen ourselves against that spiritual desolation and remind us that it's just temporary. And God does have a time appointed when it's going to end.
Well, just even thinking about over the years of a career, right? And just thinking about, times that were, maybe more of a struggle and how that can make you appreciate, as you work through things, make you appreciate the blessings of God, make you appreciate what he's brought you through, and that where he takes you doesn't need to own you or define you, right? To hold his blessings with an open hand. And I think that's the other advantage of going through a time of testing and time of lack is that you're able to hold things with an open hand. You're able to have gratitude and not start to feel entitled, right? As you start to see God's promises coming through in your life.
Yeah, I know for me, when I look at some of the trials and testing that I've gone through, there's really 3 things I think that God is or can be doing. Sometimes it's more than one thing, but it's definitely one of the 3. But one is he's maturing us, like that character piece. But then sometimes the trials come to redirect us. Like I know for me, a major trial that I went through, it sent me down a road that I would have never, ever gone down if the storm wouldn't have come. It sent me back to school and getting more equipped and getting more tools in my tool belt to do what God was ultimately calling me to do. But it came through a trial. And so sometimes the trial, it's to mature us for sure, but sometimes it's to redirect us in a direction that we would never go if the storm never came. Like I think of Paul is going to Rome. Remember that story in the New Testament, and a storm comes. He's in a ship and he ends up on the island of Malta and he shares the gospel. Well, God redirected him through a major trial. I'm sure he would have loved to have done without the storm that almost killed him, but God used it for his purpose. But then the other thing is that God can use trials to correct us, like with Jonah. It's like he's out of God's will, and so the trial comes and he ends up getting spit up on where he's supposed to be, but God uses it. And so when I look at my life, I know that God has always used trials, but it's the cooperating with it that makes all the difference.
Yeah, just there's at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, there's a passage that's a little overwhelming, but just talking about the living creatures and how they have kind of a cadence of hearing the voice of God, praising Him, moving in a certain direction, and then pausing. To paraphrase significantly, they pause and then they worship and they hear the voice of God and then they go in another direction. And it's very much like a sailboat tacking, because if you're trying to sail a direction into the wind, you can't sail directly into the wind. You have to pivot. You have to kind of zigzag towards the wind to be able to catch it and go towards your destination. And I think of that as how God leads us sometimes, where it looks like we're going in one direction, but we have to stay tuned in so that we can tack, we can pivot. And we may be thinking where we are is that ultimate destination, and then we start to get uncomfortable, right? We start to feel like the wind's a little off, right? It starts to get a little wavy, a little rocky, but it's God motivating us and prompting us to tack so that we get to where He wants us to go. So it's that discomfort, but it's also incumbent on us to stay attuned to where God is taking us.
The seasons of testing are so, so important for us to accomplish what God has called us to do. Without it, it's just like the Titan sub and the Titanic. I mean, we have to be tested and vetted before God unleashes us. And so the more we cooperate in the process, the better things go for us and the people around us. Final thoughts, Jeff?
This is going to sound weird, but no, I don't have any. At least not right now. I probably will as soon as we stop recording. But
all right. Well, thank you so much for listening today. And I just want to remind you that we have our Reset Retreat coming up September 15 and 16 at the Fountain Church. You can learn more about that on our website, and we look forward to sharing with you next time.
Thank you for listening. We hope this message encouraged you. For additional resources or information on our upcoming events, head to resetministries.us. That's resetministries.us.